There are truths that time attempts to erase, ancient memories covered by the golden dust of legends, facts deliberately buried, because they were too strange, too disturbing to appear in our school textbooks. When we think of ancient Greece, our minds evoke brilliant images: the white marble of Athens, the idealized statues, philosophy, democracy, the Olympic Games, and of course, the warriors. Heroic soldiers, proud hoplites marching in step, shield in hand, bronze helmet, perfect discipline. The elite of a civilization we call civilized. But this is only a mask. For behind this smooth and noble image lies a much more brutal reality, more savage, more visceral. What you are about to hear tonight, these are the forgotten practices of Greek warriors, strange rituals, sacred or bloody gestures, traditions that have been erased deliberately because they clashed with our idealized vision of ancient Greece. And yet they were there, lurking in forgotten texts, in the margins of manuscripts, in testimonies from authors rarely quoted, rites of passage, ordeals of suffering, trance dances, blood oaths, and much more. But before we dive together into these revelations, allow me a question. Where are you listening from? Are you comfortably settled on a couch in the muffled darkness of your living room? Perhaps you are walking, earphones screwed into your ears while the world continues around you. Or maybe you are already lying down, eyes half closed, ready to let yourself be carried by this voice that will gently guide you through the meanders of history. No matter where you are welcome. Here now in this sanctuary of ancient tales. Take a deep breath, slow, deep, and let your mind travel. For this story is not like the others. This is not a school lesson. This is not a classic documentary. This is a dive into shadow, a crossing of the invisible. What I am about to tell you, these are the forgotten rituals of the warriors of ancient Greece. These men, whom we call civilized, were not just disciplined soldiers. They were also fierce believers, superstitious, practitioners of customs that, today, would seem barbaric to us, but which, in their eyes, were sacred. Before war, they invoked the gods. They drank, bled, screamed, prayed. They danced in dust and sweat. They carved into their flesh the marks of their commitment. And when they fell, they were mourned according to rites as codified as they were strange. We will speak of the young boys of Sparta, torn from their mothers to become human weapons, of Athenian epheboy, subjected to ordeals of humiliation to become men, of generals who consulted animal entrails before advancing their army, of soldiers who sealed their brotherhood in blood, of war cults dedicated to forgotten divinities where they bordered on possession. And that will be only the beginning. If this kind of ancient truth intrigues you, if you like to discover what history has tried to hide, then I invite you to subscribe, for this journey is just beginning. And it will take you far, very far, into a world where pain was a necessary passage, where death was not an end, and where combat began, long before the battle. May the gates of the past open, and may the flickering light of ancient torches illuminate us once again. It all begins with a rupture, a slow, precise, sometimes cruel tearing away, a moment when the child ceases to be a child. In ancient Greece, one did not become a warrior through the simple growth of the body. One became so through ordeal, through endurance, through renunciation. The Greek city-states all had their customs, but all agreed on one thing. One had to die to childhood, to be reborn a soldier. Among all of them, it is Sparta that crystallizes this process with the most rigor and brutality. The word itself still resonates like a whisper of steel, the agoge. From the age of 7, a young Spartan boy was removed from his home. No more warm bed, no more maternal tenderness, no more games. He was delivered to the city, not to be trained, but to be forged. He learned to survive in the cold, to endure hunger, to steal without being caught, but above all, to never cry. For in Sparta, weakness was not human, it was shameful. The ancients said, better to die standing than to flinch under the whip, and that whip, they wielded it with precision. Each year, the young were gathered in the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia, the huntress goddess. Wild, indomitable. There, bare-chested, the boys had to endure the blows. Violent, repeated blows, administered before the priests and the crowd. Their backs bled, their legs trembled, but they remained standing. Why? Because to fall was to lose face, and in Sparta, honor was worth more than life. Some died. Yes, they died, and the city erected a stele in their name, not to mourn their loss, but to salute their bravery. If Sparta raised its children with lashes of the whip, Athens preferred the mask of reason. But behind philosophy hid rites just as strange. Around age 18, the young citizen became an ephebe. This title was not earned solely by birth, but through a rigid passage. He was shaved. He was given a spear, a shield, and a short cloak, the chlamys. Then he was sent for 2 years to the isolated garrisons of Attica to watch the borders. But certain passages did not appear in Plato's speeches. Certain accounts evoke secret ordeals conducted at night. The young had to walk barefoot in the forest, without light, reciting hymns to the ancient gods. Then they entered a clearing. There they were blindfolded, and an elder confronted them. Not to wound them, but to disorient them. Psychological shock, instability, doubt. The objective? To simulate symbolic death, to birth fear, confusion, loss of identity. When they returned to camp, they were placed in isolation for 3 days, without speech, without abundant food, with a single object, a stone. A stone they had to hold against their chest, never setting it down. A symbol, heavy, cold, uncomfortable, like war itself. There was one thing the Greeks knew better than anyone. War is not won with muscles alone, but with bonds, invisible pacts, promises that are carved not on paper, but in flesh. This is where the oath rituals begin. In several Greek cities, and notably in Thebes, young warriors formed duos called syzygites. 2 young men, sometimes of the same age, sometimes a few years apart, were bound by an oath, never to betray each other, to die for one another, and above all, to fight as one blade. This bond was not symbolic, it was sealed in blood. Each made a slight cut on his palm. A few drops were mixed in a cup of wine. Then they drank in turn, pronouncing an ancient prayer, transmitted by the soldier priests. May war take me if I abandon you. May oblivion consume me if I turn my gaze away when you fall. Once the pact was sealed, they slept side by side. They ate together, and they fought together. For in the eyes of the Greeks, union in war was not merely tactical, it was sacred. Before being sent to the battlefield, a young man often had to go through a ritual duel. This was not a duel to kill, it was a duel to test. In Corinth and Euboea, notably, they organized simulated combats between recruits, but the objective was not to win. It was to resist pain, humiliation, of judgment. The loser was not punished physically, but he was made to wear a wooden mask, often grotesque. He had to display it for several days, sometimes an entire week. The ancients said, "He who knows how to laugh at his fall knows how to walk at the edge of death." This mask, heavy, uncomfortable, served as a burden. The wearer was forbidden to speak to others. He became transparent, a living ghost, until he was able to prove his worth in a new trial. But certain rites went even further. They did not content themselves with testing the spirit, they marked the body. In Crete, for example, elite young soldiers received voluntary scarification after their first complete training. A symbol was carved, sometimes a Greek letter, sometimes an abstract motif, into the skin itself, using a bronze knife. No ointment, no care, just a piece of burned linen, applied to the wound to cauterize it. This mark was not aesthetic. It had no religious value. It was a bond, a constant reminder that the body belonged to the city, and that as long as it bore this symbol, the soldier had no right to flee. In certain Macedonian traditions, rarer but attested, the soldier surviving his first battle received a ritual burn. On the left shoulder, a piece of white-hot bronze was briefly placed. The metal left a mark, small, discreet, but indelible. It was called to charagma the trace. It signified, "I have seen death, and I remain standing." If the body had to be formed, the soul had to be opened. For war, in the Greek mind, was not a purely human affair. It was inhabited by the gods, by spirits, by invisible forces that man could not understand, but to which he had to submit. This is why many warrior rituals were in reality religious acts. Little known to the general public, Annihilus was a primitive incarnation of Ares, the god of war, a more brutal, more ancient, more fierce Ares. Among Thessalian soldiers, a rite was dedicated to him before each departure for combat. An animal was sacrificed, often a black dog. Its blood was spread on the bare chests of recruits using laurel leaves. Then they recited, in a circle, a prayer forbidden to non-initiates. The words were kept secret, transmitted by voice, never in writing. It was about surrendering to the god's rage, no longer fighting as a man, but as a sacred instrument of war. Dionysus and martial trance. Dionysus is often associated with wine, celebration, ecstasy. But in certain cities, notably in the Greek colonies of Asia Minor, he was also invoked before battles. Groups called warrior thyases gathered apart at twilight. There they drank a decoction mixing wine, roots, and resins. The effects were close to intoxication, but not only. They sang, they beat drums, They turned in circles, arms raised, eyes rolled back, until one of them, often the youngest, collapsed to the ground, shaken by spasms. It was said then that he had been seized by the god, that he now carried the spirit of Dionysus, and that he would fight without fear, without pain, without remorse. It is easy today to judge these scenes as simple performances, but for the Greeks, they were very real. Possession was seen as a superior state, a moment when the soul left the body to make way for the divine. In certain training camps, young men were trained to simulate this state to deceive the enemy. Uncontrolled rolls, shrill screams, disjointed movements, everything was codified. The objective? To sow confusion, create fear, give the impression that the soldier was no longer a man, but a beast, or worse, a servant of hell. Before departing for combat, each soldier received a ritual object, a polished pebble, a feather dipped in blood, a bone fragment, a piece of rope. These talismans were blessed by priests. They were attributed the power to deflect an arrow, confuse the enemy, or guide the soul to the Elysian fields in case of death. They were sometimes sewn into the lining of the cloak, or hung inside the helmet, invisible but present, like a silent prayer. Warrior initiation in ancient Greece was not a rite. It was a path, and sometimes an abyss. For not all reached the end. Not all crossed the final step. And for those, fate was often worse than death. To refuse an initiation rite was to refuse to belong to the polis, the city. In Sparta, a young boy who tried to flee the agoge was considered a traitor. He was not executed. That would be too simple. Number. Everything was taken from him. His name, his status, his future. He became Atropos, the invisible one. He could no longer marry, no longer vote, no longer inherit. He lived, but like a ghost among the living. In certain cities, failure was not merely a moral shame. It also left a visible trace. In Delos, for example, adolescents who abandoned a passage ceremony received a cut on the forehead. Small, discreet, but permanent. This was not a punishment. It was a warning for others, a way of saying, here is what becomes of one who breaks the sacred bond. In Aegina, they went further. Failing young soldiers were dressed in a brown tunic, the color of earth. They had to walk barefoot for an entire moon, perform public chores, and keep silent. Always. Some never spoke again, even after their reintegration. For shame, in Greece, was a prison more solid than any wall. But there also existed another form of exclusion, less visible, more cruel. Some young men were not publicly excluded, but they were left aside. They were not called for patrols. They were not included in rites. They remained on the margins, eternal apprentices, deprived of passage, deprived of fulfillment. They became the shadows of the camps, used for menial tasks, silently mocked, ignored in songs. And sometimes they disappeared. Some fled. Others got lost in the mountains, and others took their own lives. But this was not spoken of. Their names were erased. They simply said, he was not ready. In the Greek imagination, the worst thing that could happen to a soldier was not to die in combat, but to die without honor. A man who died without having passed the initiation rites did not receive the classical funeral honors. No laurel crown, no song, no tears. Sometimes they even refused to bury him in sacred ground. His body was left at the margins of the city or in the hills, so that beasts would come to carry him away, and thus his name would never be pronounced, his memory never invoked. Perhaps this is why so many of these rituals have disappeared, because they were not glorious, because they frightened, because they reminded that behind each soldier there was a fracture, an invisible wound, an internal battle far more violent than the one fought with a spear. And yet, it was these rituals, these ordeals, these silences that forged the greatest warriors of ancient Greece. For before learning to kill, they had to learn to be silent. Before learning to conquer, they had to learn to lose. And before learning to live, they had to cross through death without yielding to it. In the modern imagination, a Greek soldier equips himself, trains, and goes into combat. But what we forget is that in antiquity, the most important equipment was not always visible. Before lifting their shield, Greek warriors raised their eyes to the sky. Before marching toward the enemy, they bowed before altars. And before facing death, they asked permission from the gods. For combat in Greece was never purely military. It was a total ritual, a sacred theater where each gesture, each word, each offering had mystical weight. No Greek army worthy of the name departed without having consulted the signs. This often began with a simple but crucial ritual, the sacrifice of an animal, a sheep, sometimes a rooster, rarely a bull, too sacred. It was slaughtered at sunrise. Then a priest or diviner, sometimes even a commander, inspected the entrails, the liver, the heart, the color of the blood. Every detail had its interpretation. A liver too pale? The battle would be difficult. Black spots on the spleen? Someone in the army was going to die. And if the entrails fell to the ground during examination, everything stopped. The attack was postponed. Prayers were made, libations. They waited for a clearer sign. There existed, in certain regiments, a little-mentioned practice, that of ritual drinks, decoctions of plants, mixtures of wine, honey, and aromatic resins, sometimes completed with strange powders, with little-known effects. It was said they gave courage, that they cut fear, that they awakened the warrior instinct. But certain later testimonies speak of hallucinations, of soldiers who heard voices, saw shadows moving on the ground, or believed they saw the goddess Nike running at their sides. These drinks were given just before combat. They were blessed, sometimes accompanied by a whispered chant, and it was forbidden to know the complete recipe. Only the elders transmitted it, and always orally. Among the Boeotians and in certain island armies, one found a fascinating and chilling gesture. Just before departure, each soldier cut his palm slightly, a simple, quick stroke. The blood had to flow, and it had to touch the ground. This gesture was symbolic. I give back to the earth what may return to it today. It was believed that this gift of blood averted misfortune. Better to offer a drop of oneself than lose everything. And sometimes the blood was mixed with earth, then formed into a small clay ball, an improvised talisman placed in one sandal under the heel to walk with the blessing of Greek soil. Each warrior, before closing his helmet, recited an intimate prayer, often transmitted by his mother or an elder. It was murmured from the edge of the lips, without witness. It varied from one man to another, but the tone was always the same: solemn, humble, sometimes desperate. If I must fall, let it be with eyes open. If I must live, let it be without cowardice. If I must kill, let it not be in vain. Some, before saying it, kissed a stone. Others touched their heart 3 times. These gestures were not imposed. They were inherited from generation to generation, like secrets, sealed in blood. A Greek warrior never considered his weapon as a simple tool. It was not an object forged and assembled, but a companion, a sacred extension of the arm, of the will, sometimes even of the soul. Before each battle, before each march, a discreet but codified ritual was observed: the preparation of weapons. The shield hoplon was the most important object in the arsenal, not because it protected, but because it committed. To abandon one's sword, that was forgivable, but to lose one's shield, that was infamy. A Spartan proverb says, "Come back with your shield, or on it." For the shield did not only protect the one who carried it, it protected the soldier to his left. Each man, before combat, placed his hand on his shield and murmured a formula. It varied according to region, but the essence remained the same: "May I not betray you, may you not leave me." Some elders went so far as to baptize their shield with a proper name, a name they only pronounced before dying, like a faithful friend who would accompany them even to the grave. The sword could be inherited, transmitted from father to son, sometimes even from master to student. It was never given lightly. It was the subject of a passage ritual. During this ritual, the young recipient had to touch the blade with both palms, then press it against his forehead. An iron mark sometimes remained, fine, light, invisible to the eye, but burning with significance. It was said that the warrior's soul was then inscribed in the metal, and that if the sword was betrayed, it would break by itself during combat. But not all weapons brought luck. Certain equipment was considered tainted. If it had belonged to a coward, a traitor, or a soldier who died without honor, it became forbidden objects. Diviners said that these weapons drank the strength of their bearer, and that they always ended up betraying the one who wielded them. In certain temples, notably in Delos and Eretria, entire rooms were reserved for the deposit of these banished objects. They were sealed in stone chests. Warnings were carved on them: "Let no one take up this iron again, for shame still sleeps within it." Even a good weapon had to be purified. Before each combat, a soldier placed his sword in a cloth soaked in an herbal infusion: sage, thyme, sometimes even cooked wine. It was left to rest for a few moments. Then it was wiped slowly, always in the same order: the handle, the blade, the point. This gesture was not meant to clean it, but to reset it. It was said that this erased previous murders, that the sword, thus purified, would not be weighed down by past deaths, and that it would kill without trembling. There exists another weapon, much more subtle than the blade, faster than the arrow, more invisible than poison. This weapon the Greeks had mastered: fear. But to use it, one first had to invoke it, then tame it, finally project it. Before combat, Greek armies advanced while singing, not for folklore, but for psychological strategy and for sacred ritual. The songs, often called paeans, were dedicated to Apollo or Ares. They set the rhythm of the march, established the beats, one step, one voice, one breath, one impact. But what is often forgotten is that these songs were not always harmonious. Sometimes they became moans, muffled cries, obsessive repetitions of syllables, a form of rhythmic trance. They did not sing to give themselves courage. They sang to leave their humanity behind. Among the Cretans, a very ancient tradition was still practiced in the 5th century BCE, the Pyrrhic, a military dance, fast, rhythmic, violent. The soldiers turned on themselves, simulated sword strikes, stamped their feet against the ground. Sometimes they danced with torches or with their eyes closed. This was not training. This was an invocation, a call to the gods, but also a preparation of the body for adrenaline. It was said that those who danced thus just before battle felt less pain and saw more clearly. Each army had its cry, a howl, a guttural sound, a god's name launched at full throat. Among the Spartans, it was often a simple alale, short, brutal, raw. But this cry, repeated by hundreds of men at the same moment, became a wave, a vibration, a wall of sound. Enemies dreaded it, for it did not come from a single man. It came from a mass, from a collective entity, dehumanized, possessed by sacred rage. Some generals ordered to scream until exhaustion, even before engaging the first blow. This was not a war cry. This was a discharge, an absolute release of everything held within oneself. Fear, anticipation, hatred, and once emptied, the soldier became an instrument. Rarer, but attested in certain fragmentary accounts. Training in feigned rage. Before combat, a few chosen warriors entered into a form of simulated hysteria. They tore off their clothes, beat their chests, clawed their faces, rolled on the ground. They were sometimes called the Fury Leaders. Their role? To sow confusion in enemy ranks, to give the illusion that the entire army was out of control. But in reality, everything was calculated. They rose, calm, at the exact moment when the first line touched the enemy front. As combat approached, gestures slowed. The din of songs gave way to a heavy silence. Glances were exchanged. Fingers sometimes trembled, even among veterans. This was the moment between two worlds. The moment when life was not yet threatened, but no longer entirely assured. And in this suspended moment, the Greeks had their rituals. There existed a strange gesture observed in many Greek armies. A soldier placed his hand on the shoulder of the one in front of him. Then that one did the same. A silent chain thus formed, up to the last man. This contact had deep meaning. I am here. I see your fear, and I march with you. In elite units, this touch was sometimes made to the nape of the neck. More intimate, more risky, but stronger too. There were no words, just pressure. A physical reminder that one would not die alone. In certain regional traditions, words were forbidden in the final minutes before confrontation. They spoke through eyes, through hands, through signs learned from childhood. a thumb placed against the chest. I protect you. Two fingers raised toward the sky. Remember me. These signs were not universal. They were transmitted in garrisons like a secret language, a survival code, a farewell code. In certain armies, each soldier carried with him a handful of sand, enclosed in a small knotted cloth. Just before charging, he untied it and let it fall at his feet. An almost invisible gesture, but heavy with meaning. Here is my land. Here is my trace. If I fall, this is where I surrender myself. It was said that this sand guided the soul, that it prevented the deceased from getting lost in the afterlife, and that the dust thus returned to earth appeased the gods. It happened in certain phalanxes that a phrase was spoken before striking, but this was never improvised. It was a brief formula, a sacred word, learned, repeated, transmitted. May the light see me by my breath. May shadow fall for the earth and my kin. These words were not a prayer. They were oaths of impact. Some murmured them, others shouted them, but all knew that once the phrase was spoken, there was no turning back. And then came the final moment, the last look, the last free breath, the tremor in the left leg, the one that would carry the first charge. One no longer wondered if one was going to die. One no longer prayed. One no longer thought. One became empty, but not empty of emotions, empty of resistance. The body ready, the soul delivered, the man absent. And only then could war begin. Combat had not yet begun, but already Greek soldiers were striking the adversary, not with spears nor with swords, but with the gaze, silence, the image they projected. For war, among the Greeks, was as much psychological as physical. They knew it. Making doubt, making tremble, making hesitate was sometimes worth more than striking the first blow. And for this, they had precise rituals, cold, meticulous, terribly effective. The Greek soldier did not always wear armor to protect himself. Sometimes he wore it to deceive. One found helmets with full visors, with deformed features, wide eyes, open mouth, crushed nose, an aesthetic that was more grotesque mask than real protection. Why? Because by modifying his face, the soldier became other. He became a beast, a demon, a being without fear, without pity. A monster emerged from Hades. One also found red plumes fixed to the top of helmets, not to look pretty, but to appear taller, more menacing, more unstable. Some even colored their armor with dried blood. Others carved incomprehensible symbols on their shield, in a language dead for centuries. All of this had only one goal: to destabilize. In several Greek traditions, notably among mercenaries, the face became a canvas of war. Before combat, ash, charcoal, or colored clay was applied. Black around the eyes, red on the cheeks, vertical lines on the forehead. Some even drew a frozen smile, others tears. This was not art. This was a mask, a tool of terror. It was said that those who fought with painted faces never retreated, not because they were more courageous, but because they had abandoned their humanity. A detail often ignored, but fundamental. The Greeks trained certain soldiers to breathe loudly, noisily, in the minutes before impact, not to calm themselves, but to be heard. Amplified breath under the helmet, panting that became rhythmic, an almost animal grunt. Imagine a line of 100 men, all breathing like hungry beasts. The sound alone was enough to sow doubt in enemy ranks. This breath, called noe dramatike, was taught only to the most seasoned, for if poorly used, it could lead to hyperventilation and panic. But mastered, it became music of war. Another ritual, very simple in appearance, fixing the adversary. For a long time, without blinking, young soldiers were trained to sustain a gaze for several minutes, even under tension, even sweating, even in pain. This gaze had to be empty, neither anger nor fear, just a mute presence, a silent declaration. You will not break me. I am already elsewhere. And sometimes that was enough. When the lines finally clashed, chaos was born. But for certain Greek soldiers, this chaos was orchestrated. For every gesture, even in the midst of battle, could become a message, a warning, terror carved into the enemy's memory. Certain soldiers, as soon as they wounded an adversary, plunged their hand into the blood, then spread it on their bare chest, on their face, on their shield. This was not uncontrolled frenzy. This was a signal. The message was clear. I am ready to cover myself with your blood, and that of others. Sometimes they traced symbols with this blood, a spiral, a circle, a vertical line. No one really knew what they meant, but in the confusion, it was enough to sow doubt. Yes, laughter, cold laughter, long, disturbing. Certain soldiers trained to laugh under shock. At each blow given, each wound inflicted, each cry heard. This laughter was not human. It was hoarse, mechanical, insistent. It did not express joy, but a total absence of fear. And for the one who heard it, this laughter became an aggression, a sonic poison, a mental fracture. In certain elite units, men were selected solely for this role, the laughers. They fought at the center of the line, and their mission was not to kill, but to distract. Among the most disturbing practices, certain armies practiced ritual mutilation of enemy dead. Not all, only a few, often the first fallen. Their helmet was removed, their face was exposed, and an object was added, a stone in the mouth, a coin in the eye sockets, a nail planted in the ground through their hand. This was not from sadism, but to send a sacred message. Your soul will not cross over. You will remain here in horror. Certain legends report that these gestures prevented the deceased from joining the Elysian fields. He remained prisoner of the battlefield, a ghost, an example. Opposite to the din, there existed an equally powerful ritual, sudden silence. Imagine, an army advances, screams, sings, then everything stops. In an instant, not a word, not a sound. This silence, so well orchestrated, was like breath withdrawn from the world, a suspension, an invisible threat. In this sonic void, the enemy projected his worst fears. He wondered, why don't they speak anymore? What are they going to do? And sometimes it was in this silence that the Greeks charged, without cry, without call, just a human tide with no apparent soul. Greek warfare did not stop with the last arrow. It continued in the gaze of survivors, and above all, in what the victors left behind. For conquering was not enough. One had to impress, frighten, and above all, warn. On certain battlefields, Greek soldiers took care to arrange enemy corpses, not randomly, but in precise positions, sometimes grotesque, sometimes poetic. An arm stretched toward the sky, a body seated back against the stone, eyes wide open, a finger pointed toward the road leading to the enemy city. These gestures had a simple objective: to create images, scenes that survivors could never forget. It was said that certain generals requested that enemy dead be placed in a circle, as if they were conspiring. A last cruel laugh before disappearing. When the occasion presented itself, soldiers carved words on abandoned shields, sometimes with a knife, sometimes with the very blood of the vanquished. Simple messages. We will return. Here courage dies. Turn around and you will see death. Other times, they left enigmas, phrases that only made sense to those who had already heard them, words of family, oath, or betrayal. These inscriptions became words suspended in the wind, readable by all but understood by few, and in this ambiguity resided their power. A strange tradition, observed among certain cavalrymen and scouts. Just after battle, they drew in the dust. Using their sandals, they traced circles, spirals, animal forms, labyrinths. It is told that an Arcadian general traced an upside-down horse silhouette each time he won a victory, and that another left the imprint of his closed fist in the mud like a signature. These marks were not personal signatures. They were mental imprints, symbol fragments destined to strike the imagination of enemies who would return to see the battle site. In legends and sometimes in semi-historical accounts, one evokes the case of erected dead, corpses tied to stakes, dressed in shining armor, straightened on the hill, in full sunlight. From afar, they still seemed standing, ready to charge, mute but menacing. Nothing was said, no explanation was left. These metal silhouettes were there to disturb the natural order. A dead man should not be seen thus. He should rest. But the Greeks knew it. What troubles order and troubles the mind. And a troubled soldier is a weakened soldier. Not everything was visible on the battlefield. Certain Greek warriors, or rather those who commanded them, called upon unspeakable forces, rites not recognized by temples, words spoken in low voices, in shadowy corners. For there was a visible war, and another invisible one. In several Greek cities, small lead plates were found after battles, buried under stones. They bore inscriptions engraved with a stylus, names, symbols, orders. May Tent lose his arm. May fear take Y before he strikes. May Z's sword turn against him. These plates were called katadesmoi. They were prepared before combat, sometimes by priests, often by women or marginal figures considered close to the invisible. They were buried in strategic places, under roads, at the entrance to camps, near water sources. The goal? To bind the enemy's spirit, to weigh it down, to confuse it. In certain elite units, a very particular soldier was designated. He was not the strongest, nor the fastest, but the most receptive. He was sometimes called the one who carries the shadow. Before combat, he received a sealed object, a braided rope, a black stone, a piece of cloth knotted 7 times. This soldier had to walk last in the line. He did not fight, he watched. And if the army failed, it was said that the fault came from him, that he had poorly carried the invisible charge, or that he had broken the link. He was then banished. Or worse, a second role was imposed on him, that of the ritual sacrifice. Another practice, much more obscure, that of anticipatory offering. Certain strategists spilled blood even before battle, not from an animal, but from a prisoner or a volunteer. The blood was poured at the foot of a tree or on a flat stone, accompanied by incomprehensible words, often in archaic dialect. This rite was known only to a handful of initiates, but it was said to open the way or close fear. Some soldiers refused to march if it had not been performed. Others volunteered to be the offering. They were not killed, no, but cut. Their blood served as ink to write on the earth. Finally, in remote Greek countryside, certain armies believed that the dead could return, not as ghosts, but as warnings. They invoked the names of warriors lost in past battles. They placed their weapons in the middle of camp. They recited their exploits in low voices at night. Sometimes, a young soldier was chosen to speak in the name of the ancients. He stood upright, eyes closed, and pronounced words he said he did not understand himself. They listened to him, then fell silent. And if a bird cried at that moment, they saw it as a sign. In ancient Greece, dying in combat was not an end. It was a passage, a delicate transition between two worlds. And for the one who fell, everything did not depend on him, but on those who remained. For the destiny of a warrior, after his death, rested entirely in the hands of his brothers in arms and in the complex rituals they performed for him. When combat ceased, the first to rush onto the battlefield were not always scavengers, but the companions of the deceased. They searched for him. They recognized him often by his helmet, a scar, a ring. Then they undressed him, slowly. They wiped his body, not for hygiene, but to return him to the gods. The water used was not just any water. It had to be taken from a spring or river near the place of death. Living water, moving water. Sometimes a few drops of olive oil were added, or aromatic herbs, mint, laurel, thyme. The body was washed in silence, without tears, without words, just precise gestures, learned from childhood by elite soldiers. After cleansing came anointing. The body was coated with perfumes, not to preserve it, but to honor. For a perfumed dead was a respected dead, a dead who could enter the afterlife with head held high. The most prized oils came from Asia Minor, expensive, thick, perfumed with myrrh or nard. They were applied in concentric circles starting from the heart, then on the palms, the temples, the heels. A strange ritual consisted of touching the deceased's forehead with the thumb after anointing, as if to deposit there a final memory. The warrior did not depart naked, but he did not wear his finest armor either. Often a simple tunic was chosen, of dark color, black, blue, or terracotta, never white. The fabric was sometimes woven by the mother, sister, or wife of the deceased. It could bear a sewn symbol, a spiral, an eye, a vine leaf. And under this tunic, 3 objects were slipped, always 3. A flat pebble, a coin, and a small piece of carved wood. The pebble symbolized stability, the coin, payment to Karen, the ferryman, the wood, a memory, often carved by the soldier himself. In certain elite groups, the deceased's wrists were discreetly bound with braided rope. This bond, called demosión desmos, was not a prisoner's knot. It was a seal, a way to prevent the warrior's soul from going astray, to keep it coherent until its passage to the underworld. It was said that 2 glorious dead might be tempted to remain among the living, to haunt the places of their victory, or to refuse to leave their weapons. This rope was there to guide them and to convince them to let go. When the body was ready, the time came to move it. But in Greek culture, transporting a deceased was not a logistical task. It was a rite of passage, a moment of rupture, a final journey. For everything in this procession was a message. Those who lifted the corpse never did so alone. They were always 4, 2 in front, 2 behind, even if the body was light. And before lifting it, they bowed. A brief moment, a silence. Then, in one movement, they carried the stretcher, often a simple sheet or rudimentary bier, and advanced with slow steps. The rhythm was dictated by the ambient silence. There should be no words, nothing but shared breath and steps, regular, measured, like a funeral metronome. Behind the bearers walked the companions in arms, not the closest ones, not those who wept, but those who represented discipline, continuity, the strength of the city. Then came at a distance relatives, family, the wife sometimes, the brother, the father. They had no right to cry out, nor to throw themselves on the body as in other cultures. In Greece, one wept in intimacy. In certain cities, women could not participate in the lifting of the body, but they discreetly placed a woolen thread on the funeral cloth, a red or black thread, left visible, like a trace of mourning. When the cortege entered the streets, everything stopped. Passers-by froze. Some turned their eyes away. Others made a hand gesture, 3 fingers open over the heart. This was not a tribute to the soldier alone, but a collective ritual act of protection. For the death of a warrior was also a breach, a hole in the human wall of the city. The cortege did not always go directly to the tomb. Sometimes it stopped halfway, in a symbolic place, a clearing, a crossroads, an ancient stone. There the body was laid down. A circle was formed, and they remained motionless, sometimes for an entire hour. This was called the moment of separation, not death, but acceptance. Everyone in the circle had to think one thing, a memory, an unspoken word, a wish. Then, without any order being given, the men turned a quarter turn, backs to the body, and advanced, without looking back. Those who remained for the burial were part of a second group, fewer in number, more intimate. A very ancient gesture, often forgotten in modern accounts. One of the companions carried, at the end of the cortege, an empty helmet. He did not put it on his head. He held it in his hands, sometimes upside down, sometimes pierced. This helmet did not symbolize lost equipment, but the dead man's place in the group, his absence, his silence. It was said that the one who carried this helmet inherited for a time the weight of the soul. This burden lasted only one night, but it left traces. Some did not speak for several days after this role. Others never fought again. When the cortege reached its end, the silence became almost thicker than the earth itself. It was time to return the body, no longer to his own, but to the earth, to Hades, to oblivion perhaps, or to memory, but a different memory, underground, mute. The burial was not a funeral task. It was a ritual choreography where each gesture, each word, each object had its role. In certain traditions, the use of metal tools to dig the grave was refused. Wood was used, or even hands. Why? Because metal had spilled blood, and the earth had to be opened without violence. It was said that if the grave was too regular, the soul of the deceased would believe it a trap. It would refuse to enter and would remain. This is why certain graves were dug in a spiral, or with a stone deliberately left at the bottom, like a landmark, a shelter. The moment of placing personal objects was both discreet and highly symbolic. Luxurious objects were not placed. No gold, no jewelry, but things intimate. A handful of sand from his native region, a lock of hair from a brother, a mother, a cord braided by two, a polished bone, perhaps that of a pet. In certain tombs, dice were found, not for playing, but to force destiny. The deceased, it was said, could throw them one last time and obtain the favor of a god of chance. Others left seeds, olives, a grain of barley, to make memory grow. The most known of rites, the coin for the ferryman. But what is forgotten is that this coin was not always placed on the eyes. Often, it was slipped into the mouth. Why? Because it had to speak, and only the one who paid with his voice could pass. In certain variants, 2 coins were given, one for Charon, the other to persuade Cerberus, the 3-headed dog. It was not about buying, but about negotiating. Before closing the tomb, one of the elders leaned down and said a phrase, short, always different, but always spoken in a low voice. You are not alone. Go and watch over us. War follows you, but carry yourself no more. Sometimes the name of the deceased was not spoken because they feared the soul would cling or that it would return. But one word was always said, a word that only he could hear, a word that no one else should remember. A Greek tomb was never closed all at once. First, a thin layer of earth was placed, then a heavy object, a flat stone, a piece of armor, a bone. Only then was earth poured slowly, never all at once, never noisily. It was said that the dead had to hear the earth, that he had to feel its weight, and thus understand. Understand that it was time to leave, and that the world above continued. Once the tomb was closed, silence was not enough. Memory had to be framed, protected, directed, oriented. For in ancient Greece, a soldier fallen in combat never truly disappeared. He remained somewhere. In the words of the living, in the form of a stone, in the fold of a song. And this memory, too, was ritualized. The tomb was not marked by a cross, but by a stele, an upright stone, fine, tall, sober, sometimes adorned, sometimes smooth. Scenes of war were rarely carved on it, rather, scenes of peace. A warrior seated, a man extending his hand to a child, a soldier gazing at the horizon. These images were not there to beautify, they were there to appease, to remind that behind war there was a life, and that this life was worth telling. The name of the deceased was sometimes inscribed, but not always. In certain cities, one had to wait 7 days before engraving it, time for the soul to move away. And in certain extreme cases, for shameful deaths, for traitors, or for those fallen in lost battles, the name was removed, erased, forgotten. For in Greece, to speak a name was to bring back a part of the person, and sometimes they did not want it to return. Each year, on the same date, the deceased's relatives performed a simple but strict ritual, the Day of Remembrance. They went to the tomb. They placed wine there, bread, and a lock of hair. They recited a poem or a prayer, but never a speech. Then they stayed there, 1 hour, 2, sometimes an entire night, and they left, without looking back. For on that day, they said, the dead listens, but must not see. Certain gestures were strictly forbidden. Never weep on the tomb after sunset. Never call the deceased by his nickname. Never walk between 2 steles at night. Why? Because these gestures open, they disturb, they call, and a disturbed dead is a dead who returns. In certain circumstances, imminent war, drought, social crisis, priests could authorize invocation of ancient warriors. This was not done lightly. They fasted. They burned cypress branches. They recited the names backwards, and they placed an empty amphora on the tomb. If, in the morning, the amphora was overturned, it was said that the deceased had answered. Then they offered a sacrifice, a rooster, a fruit, a song. Then they left the tomb in peace for 7 years. No more, no less. In Greece, the memory of a warrior was not a patriotic decoration. It was a barrier, a moral rampart, an invisible line between the present and what it costs. Each stele was a reminder, a warning, a promise. Remember me, not because I killed, but because I gave everything.